Hey, this is Pastor Matt. We're in John chapter 13 today. We're continuing on with our 21 days at home with John. I'm glad you've been reading with us, and let's jump into it. So, chapter 13, if you've been reading along, this might feel kind of fast because just in the previous chapter, chapter 12, we heard the Palm Sunday story, and we saw that play out, and now all of a sudden we're at the evening of the Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples with this washing of feet story. And so there are no other events of Holy Week that are recorded in John's gospel, and that's very different from our other gospel accounts. Mark and Luke, for each of them it takes about 3 chapters to get from Palm Sunday all the way to the institution of the Lord's Supper in this same meal, in this same evening. And there are a whole lot of things that happen in between. There are a bunch of parables that are taught. There's different interactions that Jesus has with Sadducees and Pharisees and different groups. In Matthew's gospel, it takes 5 chapters. There's that much more going on. In John, we jump straight from Sunday to Thursday evening. But maybe this is a good time to pause and remind ourselves John probably has a slightly different purpose in mind as he's writing his gospel, and a different context. Because it's pretty widely accepted that John was likely the last of the Gospels to be written, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were likely in some level of circulation. Their stories were being told. There were probably copies around and starting to move around from church to church and being shared with believers. At the same time, you can probably imagine John is teaching as well, and he's telling people the stories of Jesus that he knows because he lived these stories and he was with Jesus through these things. And people probably recognized, hey, I know a lot about Jesus from reading from these other accounts, but John, you're telling some stories that I haven't heard before. And so you can imagine a situation where John realizes, I really ought to write some of these things down as well, for the sake of the church and for the sake of teaching people and so that people would know the things that I know. So later in life, John sits down and he writes out his account, not to contradict and not to correct anything in the other Gospels, but in order to tell the same story from a slightly different perspective, from the perspective of John, the follower of Jesus, the one who started off following John the Baptist and was introduced to Jesus and spent time with him. And so that's maybe a little bit of context as we get into this washing of feet. And it is interesting how John, in this evening setting, chooses not to tell a story of the Lord's Supper. That story's already been told, but he tells a story of washing of feet, and that story hadn't been told yet. And it's an important story for us to grasp and for us to receive as we see Jesus taking the role of a servant and washing his disciples' feet at this time. And the story moves from there, and we get into Jesus' interaction with Judas and some confusion among the disciples on what exactly does this mean. And of course, if we know the story, we know where this goes. But John maybe gives us some insight into, well, this is what the disciples were thinking. And this is how we didn't really know what it meant when Jesus said someone's going to betray me. Does that mean somebody's going to see one of the disciples around and recognize, oh, that must be where Jesus is, he's with them? Or was it going to be something more active in the way that Judas did betray his Lord? So we see that, we see this story unfold, and then we hear this great phrase from Jesus, and a couple of times he points to the disciples taking on roles like he has taken on, and he asks them to love one another. Verse 34, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." And I just hear, from reading this story several times, I just hear a foreshadowing of John 20:21 or 21:20. We're going to get there eventually. But Jesus telling his disciples, just as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. Do the things that I've modeled for you. Be the kind of person that I've shown you I want to be around you. Be the kind of friend that I've been to you. Love one another as I have loved you. Just as the Father sent me, so I am sending you. And maybe with that in mind, we can rewind a little bit and remember Jesus and Peter as Jesus washes Peter's feet. And Peter says, not my feet, but my whole body. And Jesus reminds him, look, those who have had a bath don't need their whole bodies washed. You just need your feet washed. And the picture we have there and what we're supposed to see there, it matches with what comes up later in chapter 21. It's a picture of forgiveness. It's Jesus saying, look, if you have salvation and you have faith and you have forgiveness, then you don't need to receive all of that again, but you do need a regular washing. And you do need to allow me to wash your feet. And as we see it in that lens, and as we see this washing in light of those kind of concepts and that forgiveness that God gives to us as his people, then we understand more fully when Jesus says, you also are to wash one another's feet. What exactly we're supposed to do. Just as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. So forgive one another. Give that forgiveness that I've given to you, and give that to one another. That's the call of Jesus. That's the invitation of Jesus, and that's what he's modeling for us in John chapter 13. Hey, today, if you've read this chapter and spent some time thinking about these things, I want you to snap a picture for me and post it online. Snap a picture of your feet. It doesn't have to be your bare feet. It can be shoes on or whatever, socks. Snap a picture of your feet, post it online, encourage one another as we follow Jesus together. Thank you for reading along. This has been John chapter 13. Tomorrow I'll be back with John chapter 14.